The year 1856 was already sick with sorrow when Sara Sutton died. The summer heat had spoiled the wells and turned the air thick enough to choke prayer from the lungs. When the fever reached her, it worked quickly, as though it had been waiting. By dawn, her breathing was shallow. By dusk, it was gone. The women who washed her body swore her skin felt colder than it should, even for the dead, and one of them crossed herself twice, certain she felt a tremor beneath the stillness. They buried her before sunrise, not out of haste, but fear. The graveyard sat at the edge of the woods, where the fog never lifted, and the soil there swallowed coffins eagerly. The preacher read the words as fast as his tongue allowed, his voice cracking, when the wind rose suddenly, lifting Sara's burial shroud just enough for her face to be seen once more. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were parted, as if she had been about to speak. That night, no one slept. Some claimed they heard knocking. Others said it was crying, low and careful, like someone afraid of being heard. A few insisted it was nothing at all, only the sound of the earth settling. By morning, footprints marked the mud between the graves, barefoot and small, leading nowhere. 3 days later, Sara Sutton came home. She stood in the doorway just after sundown, her dress stiff with dirt, her hair matted with grave soil. Her mother screamed once and fainted. Her father did not move at all. Sara looked at them with calm, unblinking eyes, darker than before, reflecting no light from the lantern that shook in her father's hand. When asked where she had been, she said nothing. When asked how she had returned, she only tilted her head, listening to something none of them could hear. Word spread faster than fear ever could. The dead girl walked. The impossible had happened. Yet what unsettled the town most was not that Sara lived again, but that she smelled faintly of earth and iron, and that wherever she stood, the room seemed to grow just a little colder, as if the grave had never truly let her go. The summer of 1856 did not arrive gently. It pressed itself into the town like a slow curse, settling in the wells, the fields, and the blood of its people. The air grew heavy enough to taste, sour with rot and stagnant water, and even the nights offered no relief. In that season, illness did not knock before entering. It slipped in quietly, warmed itself inside the body, and waited for the right moment to reveal its teeth. When the fever reached Sara Sutton, it did not feel sudden to those who watched her fade. It felt inevitable, as if something long decided had finally begun to unfold. Sara had always been a quiet child, observant in a way that unsettled adults. She noticed things others dismissed. The way the woods fell silent before storms, the way animals refused to cross certain patches of land, the way shadows sometimes lingered where light should have erased them. When the fever took her, it did not rage at first. It simmered. Her skin burned beneath the touch while her hands grew cold, and her breath came shallow. Each rise of her chest, seeming like a question the body was no longer certain it could answer. Her mother stayed beside her, pressing damp cloths to her forehead, whispering prayers that grew more frantic as the night stretched on. By the second day, Sara stopped speaking. Her eyes followed things along the ceiling, tracking movements no one else could see. Once, just before dawn, she tried to sit up, fingers digging into the mattress as though she were being pulled backward. A sound escaped her throat, not quite a cry, not quite a word, and then she collapsed again, breath shuddering. The women of the house exchanged looks they did not explain. They had seen death before. This felt different. When Sara finally went still, it happened without ceremony. One moment her chest lifted weakly, the next it did not. The silence that followed was deep and unnatural, pressing against the walls. Her mother called her name again and again until her voice broke, until even hope seemed ashamed to remain. The doctor arrived hours later, already sweating beneath his coat, already resigned. He pressed his fingers to Sara's neck, held a small mirror to her lips, and after a long pause, nodded. The word dead was not spoken aloud, but it settled over the room all the same. Preparing her body should have been routine. Death in that time was familiar. But as they washed her, something unsettled the women. Her skin cooled too quickly, as though the warmth had fled her long before her heart stopped. One woman swore she felt a faint vibration beneath Sara's ribs, like the echo of a distant drum. Another insisted the girl's eyelids twitched when they closed them, fluttering once before resting again. They said nothing of this to the men. Some truths, they believed, invited punishment if spoken to openly. The decision to bury her before sunrise came quietly. No one argued. The preacher agreed without question, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gathered his Bible. The graveyard lay at the edge of the woods, where fog clung even at midday, and the soil there was dark and damp, swallowing shovels with greedy ease. As they carried the coffin, a strange stillness settled over the land. The insects fell silent. The birds vanished from the trees. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. At the graveside, the preacher spoke quickly, words stumbling over one another as though eager to escape his mouth. When the coffin was lowered, a sudden gust of wind tore through the clearing, lifting the shroud just enough to reveal Sara's face. Her lips were parted, her expression unreadable, caught somewhere between rest and intention. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though her chest might rise again. It did not. The dirt fell hard and fast, the sound dull and final, yet something about it felt unfinished. That night, the town did not rest. Windows remained lit long past midnight. Dogs whined and refused to settle. Somewhere near the graveyard, a sound echoed through the fog. Some said it was knocking, measured and deliberate, coming from beneath the earth. Others heard crying, low and careful, as if whoever made it feared being discovered. A few claimed it was only the ground shifting, the natural settling of fresh soil. Those few did not sleep either. By morning, footprints marked the mud between the graves. Small, barefoot, uneven, as though whoever left them had struggled to walk. They led away from Sara Sutton's grave and disappeared just beyond the tree line, where the woods grew too dense to follow and the air grew too cold to breathe easily. No one spoke of them openly, but everyone saw them, and everyone felt the same quiet dread settle into their bones. A sense that the girl they buried had not remained where they left her. That death itself had not closed its hands around Sara Sutton as tightly as it should have, and that something had begun the moment her heart stopped. Something that would not remain contained within the borders of the grave or the rules the living believed protected them. Sara Sutton returned on the fourth evening after her burial, when the sun hung low and red, staining the sky like a wound that refused to close. The town was settling into its uneasy quiet. That hour when chores ended early and doors were bolted a little tighter than usual. No one saw her emerge from the road or the woods. She was simply there, standing at the threshold of her family's home, as though she had always belonged in that space between inside and out. Her dress clung to her thin frame, stiff with dried mud, the hem torn and darkened by something older than soil. Her bare feet were cracked and bruised, yet she did not seem to feel the stones beneath them. When her mother looked up and saw her, the scream that tore from her throat sounded less like fear and more like grief being split open all over again. It was the sound of a wound refusing to heal. She collapsed where she stood, the weight of disbelief crushing her knees. Her father remained frozen, lantern shaking in his grip, its light trembling across Sara's face. She looked unchanged and yet entirely wrong. Her skin bore no pallor, no rot, no sign of decay. If anything, she looked healthier than she had in weeks. Her cheeks faintly flushed, her eyes clear and watchful. Those eyes unsettled everyone who met them. They did not dart or flinch. They rested on faces with an unsettling patience, as though Sara were studying something beneath the skin. When her name was spoken, she did not respond. When she was asked how she had come home, she said nothing. Her mouth opened once, just slightly, as if testing the shape of words she had forgotten how to use, then closed again. The silence that followed felt deliberate, heavy with meaning no one could reach. Word spread before dawn. The dead girl had come back. People gathered at a distance, peering from behind fences and doorways, afraid to approach too closely. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers that tangled in their throats. A few insisted it was a cruel trick, that grief had driven the Sutton family mad. Yet when Sara stepped into the light of morning, solid and breathing, denial lost its footing. She cast a reflection in the glass. Her footprints pressed into the dirt. She ate when food was placed before her, though slowly, mechanically, as if remembering a ritual rather than satisfying hunger. The doctor returned, hands shaking worse than before. He examined her with trembling care, checking her pulse again and again as though expecting it to vanish beneath his fingers. Her heart beat steadily, her lungs filled and emptied without struggle. There was no sign of illness, no fever, no weakness. When he asked her to speak, to tell him where she had been, she only stared past him, eyes narrowing slightly, as if something had brushed against her thoughts. He left pale and silent, carrying questions he did not dare ask aloud. The death certificate remained pinned in the town records, ink already dried, name already entered. No one knew what to do with it. Sara Sutton was officially dead, yet she sat by the window each evening, watching the woods with an intensity that made her mother turn away. People argued in hushed tones about what such a thing meant. Some said it was a miracle, proof that mercy still reached even the most forgotten corners of the world. Others whispered darker explanations, voices dropping whenever Sara passed, as though she might hear thoughts that were never spoken. What frightened them most was not her return, but her calm acceptance of it. She did not cry. She did not cling to her parents or ask what had happened. She behaved as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, as though dying and returning were merely steps in a path she had always known. At night, she sometimes stood from her bed and walked the house, stopping at doorways, listening. Once her mother found her outside before dawn, facing the graveyard, head tilted, lips moving silently as if answering a call carried on the wind. Those who spoke with her felt it afterward. A heaviness settled behind the eyes. Sleep brought vivid dreams of dark soil and cramped spaces, of breath running out while something waited just beyond sight. One man claimed he woke with dirt under his fingernails. A woman fainted after meeting Sara's gaze, insisting she had felt hands around her ankle, pulling her downward. The town began to avoid the Sutton house, crossing the road rather than pass too close. Yet no one could stop watching. Sara herself seemed caught between worlds, present yet distant. She flinched at sudden sounds, not in fear but recognition, as though remembering something unfinished. Sometimes she paused mid-step, breath-catching, eyes unfocused, and when asked what troubled her, she only shook her head. Once, late in the evening, she pressed her palm against the wall and whispered a single word so softly it nearly vanished into the air. No one heard what it was, only that her voice sounded older than her years, worn thin by a place where time did not move as it should. The impossible had already taken root. A girl declared dead had returned unchanged, untouched by decay, carrying silence like a second skin. The town sensed it even if they could not name it, that whatever had allowed Sara Sutton to walk back into the world had not done so out of kindness, and that death, having lost its claim once, would not forget the path it had been shown. As the days passed, the town attempted to fold Sara Sutton back into the shape of normal life, but the world resisted the effort. The first sign came quietly, through ink and paper, rather than blood or breath, when the clerk reopened the ledger to amend the death record. His pen hesitated above the page, as though the paper itself objected. Sara's name sat neatly among the dead, date marked, 'cause recorded, finality asserted in careful handwriting. Yet when he turned the page to add a correction, the ink beneath her name appeared smeared, the letters faintly distorted, as if they had been written on damp parchment. He wiped his eyes and looked again. The words were clear, unchanged. Still, a sense of unease followed him long after he closed the book. Contradictions multiplied. The church registry listed Sara as buried, the preacher's own signature sealing the entry. The cemetery map showed a plot assigned and filled. Yet the Sutton household received ration records, school notices, and tax tallies that included her name among the living. When the clerk tried to remove her from one list or the other, the pages refused to align. Names shifted position. Numbers miscounted themselves. Once, the entry for Sara vanished entirely, leaving a thin blank space between two unrelated records, as though she had never existed at all. The town elders argued over what should be done. Some insisted the records must be corrected, that order depended on clarity. Others argued that erasing her death would invite questions best left unanswered. The death certificate remained pinned in place, yellowing with age, while Sara herself walked the streets in daylight, solid proof of a reality the documents denied. It was as if two truths occupied the same space, neither willing to yield. People began to notice other discrepancies. The grave where Sara had been buried appeared disturbed, soil sunken in uneven patches as though something beneath it had shifted repeatedly. Yet when the groundskeeper attempted to level it, the earth refused to settle, collapsing inward again and again. On one occasion, the headstone cracked down the center without warning, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the morning stillness. No one could explain it. No storm had passed. No tool had struck it. Sara seemed aware of these disturbances, though she never commented on them. She lingered near the graveyard fence, fingers brushing the iron bars, gaze fixed on the place where her name was carved into stone. When asked what she felt, she answered with a single sentence, spoken so evenly it chilled those who heard it. She said it was crowded. No one asked her to explain. The doctor attempted to resolve the matter through reason. He conducted examinations, took notes, compared her pulse and breathing against those of other children her age. His journal filled with observations that contradicted one another. Some days, Sara's heartbeat seemed slower than normal, faint but steady. Other days it raced, as though she were fleeing something unseen. Her body temperature fluctuated without pattern, sometimes cool enough to raise concern, sometimes warm enough to suggest fever, yet she showed no other symptoms. When he reviewed his notes, the figures refused to make sense, refusing to settle into a single conclusion. Even time appeared uncertain around her. People swore she looked exactly the same each morning, neither gaining strength nor losing it. Shadows around her behaved oddly, stretching in directions that did not match the sun's position, or lingering after she moved away. Once, a candle placed near her flickered, and went out despite the absence of any breeze. The wick smoked for a long moment, the smell sharp and metallic, before finally dying. The town records continued to resist correction. When the clerk attempted to remove the death certificate entirely, he found the paper fused to the board, as though it had grown there. When he finally tore it free, the page beneath bore an impression of Sara's name, pressed so deeply into the wood that no sanding could remove it. The document itself reappeared the next morning, pinned neatly back in place, edges uncreased, as though it had never been touched. Whispers grew more insistent. Some claimed the records were cursed, that the act of naming her dead had bound something to the town. Others argued that the living Sara was an error, an intrusion that reality itself was attempting to correct. Children dared one another to touch the death ledger, pulling their hands back with nervous laughter when the paper felt strangely cold. A woman who traced Sara's name with her finger claimed she felt a pulse beneath the ink. Sara moved through it all with quiet detachment. She did not protest her classification as dead or living. When shown the certificate bearing her name, she studied it with interest, head tilted, eyes narrowing slightly. After a long pause, she said the writing looked familiar, as though she had seen it from the other side. When pressed, she shook her head and turned away, leaving the question hanging. The contradiction settled into the town like a fracture that refused to heal. Sara Sutton existed in two states at once, recorded and erased, buried and breathing. The more the town attempted to force the world into a single version of events, the more reality resisted, bending and warping around the girl who had crossed a boundary no record was ever meant to document, and whose presence now pulled the living and the dead into the same uneasy ledger, where neither could fully claim her. The change in those who spoke with Sara Sutton was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as nerves or imagination, but it did not take long for patterns to emerge. A man who had only exchanged a few polite words with her at the market woke that night drenched in sweat, convinced he had been buried alive. He described the dream with shaking hands, the weight of soil pressing down, the air thinning, the sound of his own heartbeat growing louder, until it felt like it would split his chest open. He said the worst part was not the suffocation, but the certainty that someone was listening from above, waiting for him to stop struggling. When he finally woke, his lungs burned as though he had truly been deprived of air. Others reported similar visions. Women who had sat with Sara for only a few minutes found themselves dreaming of narrow spaces, of being trapped between walls that slowly closed in. Children spoke of dark places beneath the ground where whispers slid through the dirt like roots, searching for water. The dreams were vivid, relentless, and returned night after night, growing more detailed each time. Those afflicted woke exhausted, eyes rimmed with red, movements sluggish, as though part of them had not returned from sleep. Illness followed. A cough spread through the town, dry and rasping, often accompanied by a strange pressure in the chest. The doctor could find no clear cause. Lungs sounded clear. Fevers came and went without reason. Some complained of a persistent coldness that no blanket could warm, even in the height of summer. Others described a metallic taste in their mouths that lingered for days. The common thread was contact with Sara, brief or prolonged, direct or indirect. Those who avoided her entirely remained untouched. Fear grew quietly. People began to track their movements, noting who had spoken to Sara and when. Conversations faltered when she entered a room. Invitations were rescinded. The market stall, where she sometimes stood with her mother, grew empty around her, customers drifting away without explanation. Yet avoidance did not always protect them. Even those who had only glimpsed her from a distance reported unease, a sense of being watched long after she had passed from sight. Sara herself seemed unaware of the effect she had, or unwilling to acknowledge it. She listened patiently when people spoke, eyes focused, expression calm. Sometimes, during these conversations, she leaned slightly closer, as if drawn by the sound of their voices. Those moments were when the sensation was strongest, when speakers felt an inexplicable pull downward, a heaviness in their limbs, as though gravity itself had grown more insistent. A few swore they heard faint scraping noises beneath the floorboards during such encounters, a sound like fingernails dragging through packed earth. One woman, bold enough to confront the girl, demanded to know what she was doing to them. Sara considered the question carefully before answering. She said she was not doing anything at all. She said it was already there. When pressed to explain, she fell silent, gaze drifting past the woman's shoulder, attention caught by something unseen. The woman left trembling, feverish by nightfall, and dead within the week. The official cause was pneumonia, but those who attended her burial noticed the same strange stillness in the air that had followed Sara's own. The preacher attempted to intervene, inviting Sara to speak with him in the church, convinced that prayer might restore balance. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When he emerged, his face was ashen, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his Bible. He refused to say what had been discussed, only that he felt something cold pass through him when she spoke. That night, he dreamed of standing at the edge of an open grave, his shadow stretching impossibly long before being pulled downward, torn from his feet and swallowed by darkness. He did not sleep again. As the sickness spread, so did the conviction that death clung to Sara like a scent. People described it differently. Some said it felt like mourning that never faded. Others likened it to standing too close to an open grave, that awareness of emptiness just beneath the surface. Animals reacted more honestly. Dogs whimpered and pulled away when she approached. Horses refused to pass her on the road, eyes rolling white, hooves skidding in panic. Birds abandoned the trees near her home, leaving the branches bare and silent. Despite the growing fear, curiosity drew some closer. A few believed that if Sara had returned from death, she might hold answers or power, or protection against the sickness that now haunted the town. These people sought her out deliberately, speaking at length, asking questions she rarely answered. They were the ones who suffered the most. Their dreams grew darker, more intrusive. Some began to sleepwalk, found wandering near the graveyard at night, barefoot and glassy-eyed, murmuring words that made no sense when questioned later. The doctor attempted to isolate the illness, to chart its progression, but his notes devolved into fragmented observations. He wrote of a heaviness that settled over rooms Sara had visited, of air that felt thicker, harder to breathe. He noted that those affected often spoke of a presence lingering just beyond sight, close enough to feel, but never to see. He underlined one sentence repeatedly until the paper tore, a sentence that described death not as an end, but as something patient, something capable of following. Sara remained unchanged at the center of it all. She did not weaken as others did. She did not dream, or if she did, she never spoke of it. When asked why people were falling ill, she said softly that they were listening too closely. When asked to whom, she did not answer. She only looked toward the woods, where the fog gathered thickest, and for the briefest moment, her reflection in the window behind her did not move with her, lingering in place, eyes fixed on the living with a hunger that felt older than the town itself. The minister delayed, as long as he dared, before calling Sara Sutton to the church. By then, fear had begun to outweigh denial, and whispers of curses and unclean spirits followed her name, wherever it was spoken. He told himself that he had faced darkness before, that faith was meant for moments precisely like this. Yet when Sara stepped into the sanctuary, the familiar comfort of the place seemed to drain away. The candles lining the walls burned low despite being freshly lit. their flames shrinking as if starved of air. The wooden pews creaked softly, settling under a weight that had nothing to do with her slight frame. Sara walked down the aisle without hesitation, bare feet silent against the floorboards. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in the altar, the cross, the worn Bible resting upon it. She did not bow her head. She did not flinch. She stopped where the minister indicated and waited, hands folded loosely in front of her, posture calm and attentive. Up close, he noticed again how wrong she felt, not monstrous or grotesque, but subtly misaligned, as though she existed half a step out of rhythm with the world around her. He began with prayer, voice trembling despite his effort to keep it steady. He spoke of mercy, of redemption, of the boundary between life and death ordained by God. As he spoke, a chill crept through the sanctuary, raising gooseflesh along his arms. The candles flickered in unison, bending away from Sara though no breeze passed through the room. When he finished, he raised his eyes to meet hers and asked her, gently, where she had been when she died. For the first time since her return, Sara answered without hesitation. She said she had been listening. The word echoed strangely, as though the walls themselves had repeated it a moment later. The minister pressed her, asking what she had heard, whose voice had reached her beyond the grave. She tilted her head, considering, then said that it was not a voice the way people meant voices. It was pressure. It was calling without sound. He opened the Bible and read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each verse, clinging to the familiar cadence of Scripture. As he spoke, Sara's gaze drifted past him, toward the far wall. The shadows there seemed deeper than they should have been, pooling in the corners, stretching upward in thin, wavering lines. When he sprinkled holy water at her feet, it soaked into the wood instantly, leaving behind a dark stain that spread outward like a bruise. The minister felt sweat bead at his temples as he continued, reciting words of cleansing and protection. He commanded whatever did not belong in her to leave. At that, Sara finally reacted. Her brow furrowed, not in fear but confusion. She asked, quietly, where it was supposed to go. The question struck him harder than any scream could have. He hesitated, the rhythm of the rite faltering, and in that pause, the air in the sanctuary grew heavy, pressing against his lungs. Determined to continue, he raised the cross and stepped closer. The candles nearest Sara sputtered and went out, one by one, plunging the altar into uneven shadow. The minister's heart pounded as he spoke louder, voice cracking, demanding that whatever held her release its grip. Sara's eyes darkened, reflecting no light at all now, and she said that there was no grip, only closeness, only something that had learned the shape of her. It was then that he noticed the shadow. It did not belong to Sara, nor to any object in the room. In the wavering candlelight, her form cast nothing at all upon the floor. Where her shadow should have been, there was only bare wood, unmarked and empty. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped back instinctively, nearly stumbling, eyes locked on the impossible absence. He moved the lantern at his side, angling the light again and again, but the result did not change. Sara stood illuminated, solid and real, and yet left no darkness behind her. The minister's faith did not shatter in that moment, but it bent painfully, stretched beyond its limits. He lowered the cross, hands shaking uncontrollably. The prayers died on his lips. He realized then that whatever had happened to Sara had not replaced her, had not hollowed her out and filled her with something else. It had entwined itself with her, learned her boundaries, settled so deeply that there was no clean line to cut. Sara watched him with something like pity. She said that when the earth closed over her, she had not been alone for long. She said that the dark was full, crowded with things that pressed close, curious, patient. One of them had followed her breathing, memorized it, waited for the moment when her chest moved again. When the minister asked why, she answered simply that it did not want to be left behind. The attempt at cleansing ended there. The minister dismissed her with a trembling gesture, unable to bring himself to speak further. As Sara turned to leave, the lantern light shifted, and for the briefest instant, something moved where her shadow should have been, a thin distortion along the floor that recoiled as the light steadied. The minister sank into a pew, gasping, heart racing, the weight of his failure settling heavily upon him. By the time Sara stepped back into the daylight, the church felt altered, its walls older, its silence deeper. The minister would later insist that some doors, once opened, could not be closed by prayer alone, and that the absence of a shadow was not proof of holiness, but evidence that something else had claimed the space where it should have been waiting still after the failed cleansing. Something began to shift within Sara Sutton, subtle at first, like a pressure behind the eyes that came and went without warning. She grew quieter, if that were possible, withdrawing into long stretches of stillness that unsettled even those accustomed to her silence. She spent hours staring into nothing, fingers pressed lightly against her temples, as though listening to a distant sound struggling to break through layers of thought. When spoken to during these moments, she responded slowly, words chosen with care, her voice carrying a faint strain that had not been there before. Memories surfaced in fragments. She began to ask questions she had never asked before. About the night she died, about who had been present, about how long she had been alone before earth covered her completely. Her parents answered as best they could, though each response seemed to trouble her more than comfort her. At night, she woke gasping, clutching her chest, insisting that her breath did not feel like her own. She described the sensation as borrowed, as though it had been returned to her imperfectly, altered in ways she could not explain. The dreams changed as well. Where others dreamed of graves and suffocation, Sara dreamed of movement beneath the ground. She spoke once of vast spaces that should not have existed, of tunnels and hollows that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the coffin. She said the dark there was not empty, but dense, layered with presences that brushed past one another constantly, aware and waiting. She remembered the sound of her own heartbeat echoing, not inside her chest, but around her, as if the earth itself had learned its rhythm. As these memories returned, so did a growing sense of unease. Sara began to avoid mirrors, turning them face down when she passed, flinching when her reflection caught her unexpectedly. When pressed, she admitted that sometimes the girl looking back did not move when she did. Sometimes the eyes blinked a fraction of a second too late. Sometimes the reflection smiled when she had not. These moments left her shaken, hands trembling long after, as though she had glimpsed something that knew her too well. The presence she had carried quietly since her return began to make itself known to her directly. She described it as a feeling rather than a voice, a constant nearness that pressed against her thoughts. It did not speak in words, but in impressions and urges, guiding her attention toward certain places, certain moments. When she resisted, the pressure grew stronger, tightening around her chest until breathing became difficult. Compliance brought relief, a loosening that felt dangerously close to comfort. She started to remember the moment of following. Beneath layers of fear and confusion, clarity emerged. She recalled lying in the dark after her breath had stopped, aware long after pain should have ended. She remembered the curiosity that had surrounded her, the way something had lingered close, matching her stillness, waiting patiently. When her lungs finally drew air again, when life returned against all reason, she felt that same curiosity surge with her, slipping into the space she occupied, unnoticed, because there had been no resistance left to offer. The realization frightened her more than death ever had. Sara understood then that she had not come back alone. Whatever had followed her had learned from her, shaped itself around her thoughts and memories, settling into the spaces left open by fear and confusion. It was not hostile in the way stories warned of monsters. It was intimate, familiar, invested. It had grown accustomed to her body, her breath, her way of seeing the world. As her understanding deepened, so did the consequences. The town's sickness worsened. People who had avoided her entirely still fell ill, still dreamed of dark places and suffocating closeness. Sara realized with growing dread that the presence did not require direct contact anymore. It reached outward through her, stretching thin but persistent, like roots pushing through soil. The thought filled her with guilt and terror in equal measure. She began to isolate herself, locking herself in her room, pressing furniture against the door, as though that might contain what she carried. During these days, she began to hear sounds others could not. Soft movements beneath the floor, beneath the ground itself, following her steps. Sometimes she felt vibrations through her feet, gentle but insistent, like a heartbeat that did not belong to her. When she stood near the graveyard, the sensation intensified, a chorus of subtle motions beneath the earth, responding to her presence with unmistakable recognition. One evening, overwhelmed by the pressure, Sara whispered into the darkness, asking what it wanted. The answer came not as words, but as a rush of understanding that left her weak and shaking. It wanted to remember what it had been. It wanted to feel the warmth of blood and breath again. Through her memories, through her senses, it experienced the world it could no longer touch. It had followed her not out of malice, but longing, and it was learning quickly. The knowledge broke something inside her. Sara realized that the more she remembered, the more space the presence claimed. Each recovered memory, each moment of clarity, strengthened the connection between them. She began to fight her own recollections, forcing herself to forget details of the dark, of the crowded stillness beneath the earth. The effort left her exhausted, feverish, but it slowed the advance, if only slightly. Those closest to her noticed the change. She grew thinner, her movements more hesitant. Dark circles settled beneath her eyes. When asked what was wrong, she struggled to answer, knowing that naming the truth might give it more power. She began to fear sleep, knowing that dreams loosened her grip, allowing memories and impressions to flow freely. She stayed awake for days at a time, pacing her room, whispering to herself to stay present, to stay whole. Yet even in her resistance, she sensed inevitability. The presence was patient. It had waited in the dark once, and it could wait again. It did not rush her. It pressed gently, persistently, reminding her of what she owed, of the moment when she had not been alone, of the breath she had taken that should not have been possible, and the shadow that had slipped in with it, and learned how to wear her from the inside. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced through accidents, through moments of terror that no longer fit the explanations the town had clung to. The first undeniable sign came when the ground near the old well collapsed without warning, opening into a narrow sinkhole that exhaled a breath of cold air so sharp it burned the lungs. From within it came a sound like distant movement, not a cave settling, but something shifting with purpose. Those who peered into the darkness felt the same pull that had followed Sara since her return, that downward insistence that made the knees weaken and the heart race. The doctor was among the first to speak openly. He gathered the elders and confessed what he had avoided naming even to himself. He said that whatever force had returned Sara to life had not restored balance. He said that life reclaimed without permission created a debt, and that debts of that kind were never collected gently. His voice shook as he described his dreams, how they had begun to change. He no longer dreamed only of suffocation, but of doors opening underground, of spaces widening, of something learning how to move upward. Others began to add their own pieces. The groundskeeper admitted that he no longer heard silence in the graveyard. He heard shifting beneath his feet. Subtle but constant, like a crowd adjusting its weight. A woman who lived near the woods spoke of lights moving between the trees at night, low to the ground, vanishing when approached. A child went missing for several hours and was found standing at the edge of an open grave. Uninjured but unresponsive, dirt packed beneath his fingernails as though he had been digging. Attention turned toward Sara with a new intensity. Not just fear now, but accusation. People began to ask what she had brought back with her, what she had allowed to follow. When confronted, she did not deny it. She said only that she had not known the rules, that no one had explained the cost. Her honesty did not comfort them. It frightened them more. The idea that death itself could be negotiated with ignorance rather than intent made the world feel dangerously unstable. The minister, hollow-eyed and sleepless, finally named what others had sensed. He said that resurrection was never meant to be singular. He said that death was not a gate that could be opened for one and closed again. It was a threshold, and once crossed in the wrong direction, it invited traffic. He spoke of passages and permissions, of boundaries weakened by repeated listening. He said that whatever had followed Sara had not come alone, that it had learned from her how to reach upward. The town began to change its behavior in ways that revealed how deeply the fear had taken root. Doors were sealed with iron nails. Windows were shuttered before sunset. Families slept together in single rooms, as though closeness might anchor them to the living. Yet these measures offered little comfort. People continued to dream of earth, giving way beneath their feet, of hands brushing their ankles from below. Some woke with dirt on their clothes, no memory of leaving their beds. Sara understood then that the cost was not hers alone to bear. The presence within her stirred more actively now, responding to the town's growing panic. She felt it reach outward with increasing confidence, testing the spaces between people, the thin places where fear had worn reality down. She realized that her return had acted as an opening, a proof of concept. If one could come back, others could follow, or be brought. The dead began to behave differently. Graves sank faster than they should have. Coffins cracked underground without cause. A body buried only days earlier was found closer to the surface than expected. Soil disturbed around it from below. The smell of decay lingered longer in the air, heavy and metallic, even far from the graveyard. People began to avoid funerals, terrified that standing too close to the dead might invite attention from beneath. Sara tried to warn them, though she struggled to find the words. She said that what followed her was learning, that it had become aware of the living world through her senses. She said it understood hunger now, not for flesh, but for presence, for warmth, for motion. It remembered what it had been only vaguely, but it remembered wanting. The more frightened the town grew, the easier it became for that wanting to take shape. A meeting was called, voices raised in anger and desperation. Some demanded that Sara be driven out, sent away to break the connection. Others argued that killing her would seal the breach. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, but its meaning was clear. Sara listened without interruption. When asked what would happen if she left, she said she did not know. When asked what would happen if she died again, she said she was afraid to find out. That fear spread quickly. The presence inside her responded to the threat with a sudden tightening, a surge of pressure that nearly drove her to her knees. She felt its panic then, sharp and instinctive. It did not want to return to the dark alone. It did not want to be trapped again in crowded stillness. It had tasted the world through her, and would not surrender it willingly. The final realization settled over the town like a funeral shroud. Sara's resurrection had not been a gift or a miracle. It had been a transaction. Something had been taken that could not be returned without consequence. The cost was still accruing, measured in fear, in sickness, in the subtle rearrangement of the boundary between above and below. The town understood then that whatever payment was coming would not be collected from Sara alone, that the debt had spread outward the moment she drew her first impossible breath, binding the living and the dead together in a reckoning that had only just begun. The final truth emerged not through revelation, but through inevitability, through the slow convergence of signs that could no longer be ignored. The town awoke one morning to a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No birds called from the trees. No insects stirred in the grass. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Beneath that stillness lay movement, subtle yet undeniable, a deep internal shifting that vibrated through the soles of their feet. The earth itself felt restless, as though something beneath it had learned to wait no longer. Sara felt it before anyone else. The presence inside her surged with unfamiliar urgency, no longer content to press and observe. It pulled at her thoughts, her memories, her sense of self, not violently but insistently, as though reminding her of an agreement she had never consciously made. She understood then what had been forming slowly since her return. Death had not followed her back by accident. It had learned from her how to cross over. It had memorized the path of breath returning to still lungs, the precise moment when life resumed, and it had been practicing ever since. The graves began to answer. At first, it was sound, a low resonance that carried through the ground, felt more than heard. Those standing near the cemetery described it as a murmur, like many voices speaking at once but too distant to understand. The sound traveled outward, touching houses, wells, roads, seeping into walls and bones. People clutched their chests, overcome by a sudden sense of familiarity, as though they recognized the call without knowing why. Then came the movement. Soul rose and fell in shallow waves. Headstones tilted, some sinking, others lifting as if pushed from below. The ground no longer behaved as a barrier. It behaved as a door left ajar too long. Sara stood at the edge of the graveyard, trembling, aware now that what lived inside her was no longer singular. It had taught others what it knew. It had shown them how to listen for breath, how to feel for warmth, how to find the thin places where life could be reached. The minister, his voice hoarse and broken, finally spoke the words no one else could bring themselves to say. He said that death had not lost its power when Sara returned. It had expanded it. It had learned desire. It had learned return. Through her, it had discovered that the boundary was not fixed, that it could be crossed not just once, but again and again, as long as something living remained on the other side to guide it. Sara realized then that she was not a vessel, but a lesson. Death did not inhabit her as a parasite. It had observed her, mirrored her, used her as proof that the separation between worlds was negotiable. It no longer needed her to move among the living. It had learned enough. What it wanted now was access. Through her resurrection, death had remembered itself not as an ending, but as a state capable of continuation. The town felt the shift immediately. The sick worsened. The dreams intensified, no longer limited to burial, but expanding into images of ascent, of hands pushing upward through soil toward light. Some people woke with dirt on their tongues, convinced they had been breathing earth in their sleep. Others claimed to hear loved ones long dead, calling their names from beneath the floors. Voices filled not with menace but longing. Sara tried to resist, but resistance no longer mattered. The presence inside her loosened its hold, not retreating but multiplying, stretching outward beyond her body, beyond her control. She understood with terrible clarity that death did not intend to replace the living. It intended to return through them. Every grave was now a potential threshold. Every memory of breath and warmth was an invitation. When the first body rose, it was not dramatic. No clawed hand burst from the ground. No scream announced the moment. A man buried weeks earlier was found standing near his grave at dawn, eyes open, chest moving, expression empty of recognition. He did not speak. He did not walk. He simply stood breathing, as though waiting for instruction. Others followed, not all at once. Not as an invasion, as a procession. The living recoiled in horror, but Sara felt only sorrow. She knew now that what had come back with her was not an enemy to be fought or banished. It was death remembering itself as unfinished. Through her, it had realized that ending was optional, that return was possible, and that the world above held sensations it had been denied too long. It had come back not to destroy, but to experience, to move, to persist. The final understanding settled into her bones like cold. Sara Sutton had never escaped death. She had carried it back, taught it how to cross, shown it the shape of breath and blood and memory. Death had not reclaimed her. It had studied her, learned her, and then used that knowledge to come home through her, quietly, patiently, until the world above and the world below were no longer separate realms, but a single, shared space where the dead no longer rested and the living no longer stood alone. People began to leave in small numbers, at first families highs packing quietly before dawn, wagons creaking down the road with everything they could carry and prayers they did not voice. Those who fled spoke later of an oppressive sense of release the moment the town disappeared behind them, as if invisible hands had finally loosened their grip. They never stopped running. They never looked back. Some claimed the road behind them seemed longer than it should have been, stretching unnaturally, as though the land itself resisted letting them go. Those who stayed learned quickly that resistance no longer mattered. The return did not attack. They wandered. They stood. They breathed. They gathered near places where the ground felt thin, where graves clustered close together, where death had been named too often and listened too carefully. The living found that fear itself became a kind of signal. Panic sharpened the connection. Grief opened doors no one could see. Sara Sutton walked among them in silence. She no longer slept. She no longer dreamed. The presence that had once pressed against her thoughts now flowed freely beyond her, no longer needing her permission. She felt lighter because of it, emptier, as though something essential had been carefully unstitched and carried away. People avoided her now not out of fear, but reverence, the way one avoids the center of a storm or the edge of a cliff. They sensed, correctly, that she was no longer the cause. On the final evening, the ground near the woods gave way completely. The earth collapsed inward, revealing a vast hollow beneath the town, an impossible space lined with roots and bones and countless narrow openings leading deeper still. Cold air poured out, heavy with the scent of soil and old stillness. The sound that rose from it was not a roar, but a collective breath being drawn in. Sara stood at the edge and understood what was being asked of her without words. She had been the bridge. She had been the lesson. Now she was no longer required. The return no longer depended on her heartbeat or her memory. Death had learned enough. It could find its way on its own. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her. There was no struggle, no dramatic fall. The ground accepted her as it had before, gently, reverently, closing around her body with practiced familiarity. For a brief moment, the presence hesitated, as if considering following again, but it did not. It no longer needed to. The hollow below pulsed once, then settled. Its hunger dispersed across the land rather than focused on a single soul. When the sun rose, the hollow was gone. The woods stood quiet. The return no longer wandered. They lay down where they stood, bodies cooling naturally, finally, and did not rise again. The sickness faded. The dreams loosened their grip. The town breathed for the first time in weeks, without feeling the ground breathe back. Sara Sutton's grave was never found. There was no marker, no stone, no record left behind. The death ledger remained blank where her name should have been, as though she had never existed at all. Those who survived spoke of her rarely, and only in careful tones, as one speaks of something that might still be listening. Years later, travelers passing through the abandoned land sometimes reported an odd sensation beneath their feet, a faint rhythmic pressure that came and went like a memory struggling to surface. They never stayed long. The earth there felt crowded, unsettled, as though it remembered a time when death learned how to return and decided patiently to wait for the world to forget again.